Hello everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your Thursday. Is today Thursday to come hang out? I appreciate it. So this is kind of just a fun little goofy talk that has something that's kind of been in the back of my head for a little bit. Not super highly technical, and more of like an approach and a methodology and a way of thinking and kind of a reframing and a recontextualizing of things for me a little bit, or maybe even just like connecting some dots a little bit in my head more than like, a list of cutting edge Windows internal research or anything like that. So thanks for popping on. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. I'm still new at this new Zoom platform, so I'm not sure if I will see or find them now, but I would love to get to those if y'all have any at some point. Cool. So just a brief agenda. So I feel like every presentation has to have the obligatory who am I to talk about this slide. So I've got one of those. We'll talk about what inspired this talk and kind of the things that I was thinking about and why it was something that I thought was interesting and worth sharing. We'll dive into a little bit of a history of the genre of Metroidvania games, as well as some of kind of the tenets of those genres that make those games kind of specifically what they are. We'll draw some analogies to pen tests and things that we've seen in real life, real world engagements and things that I think might be interesting. We'll talk a little about starting context for testing, different ways of information gathering. We'll talk about the OODA, the OODA loop. I'm not sure if you can pronounce that OODA or not, but that's probably the biggest takeaway concept from this talk, I think, is that loop, which we'll get to a little bit later in the talk. Talk about power-ups in games, power-ups on pen tests, what we can use them for, what they can get us. Some examples, more examples, and then there's a slide at the end with links to all the things that I'm going to be talking about for your reference. So no need to take notes or look things up now unless you absolutely want to. So who am I? As Jason mentioned, my name is Ben Burkhart. I'm a pen tester here at Black Hills. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. I've been testing at Black Hills since October of 2021. I've been doing testing and consulting for the better part of about 7 or 8 years now. So been doing it for a minute. A list of things that I usually work on. My primary focus at Black Hills when it comes to pen tests is assume compromise testing or pivot testing, as well as internal network penetration testing. And assume compromise, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that's kind of an Active Directory seeded access test where you're starting off as an Active Directory user on an Active Directory host. A little bit of social engineering, done some fun on-site wireless tests lately, which is always a nice change of pace. I've given a handful of talks about other things if you're interested and like the sound of my voice or the way that I say things. Those are mostly on YouTube. So there's a couple talks from other conferences. There's a Black Hills webcast out there. The last one I did was about hunting for plain text credentials in enterprise environments, which is a fun one. And then a list of things that I enjoy. This is my dog, my fiance and I's dog, Louise. She's a retired racing greyhound. And my fiance and I both work from home, and the dog has somehow learned when we are signing off from Zoom meetings and webcasts and things like that, that it is probably time for her to go out. So if we stick around long enough and I end the meeting by saying, thanks everyone, she will probably sneak in here and make an appearance. Yeah, cool. So why are we talking about this stuff today? I don't know if anyone has seen this image before, but I've got a link to it down at the bottom. This is from the Orange Cyber Defense GitHub page, and it is a mind map for internal network penetration testing. It is a methodology of branching decisions to be made. If you find this, then try this. If you find this, then try this. If you find this, et cetera, et cetera. As you can see, it is a lot. It is overwhelming. I think that there is, the number of potential attack paths that exist in large enterprise environments never ceases to shock and amaze me. And so the point of this talk is to try and find ways to orient ourselves within those environments, ways that we can kind of collect information about what we can and can't do, and ways that we can figure out how far we can get with what we can and can't do with the tools at our disposal. So another little bit of kind of background knowledge about me is I don't have a traditional path into information security like a lot of people. don't have traditional paths into this field. I went to school initially out of high school for computer sciences at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I think at the time, this is like 2004, you couldn't really study information security. It was pretty much computer science or electrical engineering if you wanted to kind of get into this type of stuff. And I wanted to go to school for computer science because I wanted to build games. I wanted to design video games, work on games. I grew up playing games. I think a lot of people in technology, also grew up with that. But from the earliest age, we had an NES, and my dad would bring home new games once every couple of weeks. So it's just always kind of been a part of my life and something that I really enjoyed. And I think once I started doing this type of work, there were a lot of really interesting analogies to every different environment kind of felt like a bit of a game. Doing a pen test is a little bit like playing a game. You're kind of figuring out what the rules are. You're kind of figuring out what constraints exist within the environment. You're kind of figuring out, what you're able to do, where the cracks are in those restraints, what you can take advantage of, how you can progress, and things like that. And so I think with that in mind, a lot of pen tests, in my experience, are not necessarily straight lines of you get dropped on a box, then you do A, then you do B, then you do C. So I think in the real world, you get dropped on a box and there's 15 different things that you can check first. So the point of this talk is to try and give you a little bit more help and some tools and frameworks for figuring out what you want to do first and where that stuff can take you. So a brief history of the genre. Metroidvania is a portmanteau, I'm pronouncing that correctly, of the words Metroid and Castlevania. The first iterations of those games were released in 1986 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I've got some links that I'll include at the end, but these are some really great retrospective videos from the YouTube channel I Finished a Video Game. As you can see, one of them is 6 hours, the other is 7 hours and 20 minutes. But if you like some interesting historical context for where these games come from and the impact that they had on the industry, as well as a deep dive into every single one of them, what worked about them and what didn't, those are some really great videos that I would highly recommend. But at the time, so just kind of briefly, back in the 80s, the kind of top selling games for Nintendo were things like Mario, where you start a game and literally just run to the right. One of the kind of groundbreaking things about the first Metroid game is once you start, you're kind of intrinsically trained to run to the right, and you're going to hit a wall or you're going to hit a door. And what you're going to have to do is actually circle back left to find a power up to be able to unlock that door and then go back to the right. So this kind of introduction of backtracking and exploring was a relatively new concept for games at the time. Another kind of addition to these genres was kind of elements of role-playing games. So the ability to power up, level up your character, obtain items that kind of improved your skills and gave you new abilities and things like that. I think some of the definitive games of the genre are Super Metroid for the SNES, as well as Castlevania Symphony of the Night for PlayStation. Both of those have probably been re-released on, well, at least Castlevania Symphony that I think has been re-released on a couple other platforms. But if you're into legal gray areas, there are ways to emulate those games pretty easily if you're interested in playing those. But those kind of took the formula of the genre and I think really polished the gameplay and the elements to kind of what we expect and imagine for the, that type of game today. This game series, or this game genre, had like kind of a resurgence in the early 2010s with a lot of indie games that were being developed and released, most notably like Ori and the Blind Forest, Hollow Knight. The last one I played personally was Blasphemous, which is kind of set in this weird like 16th century Spanish Catholicism, dark, twisted world. So a little bit of kind of like the Elden Ring aesthetic meets, a traditional Metroidvania gameplay. So what are some of the things about these games that make them really specific and part of the genre? I think the one that sticks out to me the most is this idea of a large interconnected world where there's not necessarily, a straight line from A to B, but progression is kind of limited by what you can and can't do, right? So a lot of things that, instead of being hidden just behind a locked door, there might be behind, a ledge that you might need to come back with once you've gained the ability to double jump. Or once you've gotten to a certain point and you've got a certain weapon, you can come back and blast this specific door that you couldn't get through before. So the idea of backtracking and retracing your steps and kind of taking what you found and the way that you have leveled up and powered up and revisiting to initial starting areas and seeing what else you can find in those areas I think is kind of a core tenet, and also something that really applies to pen testing in general too. Like I said, nonlinear progression, I think, is one of the main interesting things about this as well. We'll talk about it a little bit later towards the end of the talk, but there's also the concept of sequence breaking, where if you are skilled enough or find the right tools, you can bypass some of the ways that the developers have intended you to kind of play through the game. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's kind of an interesting tidbit is, you know, you don't necessarily have to go from A to B. If you find the right tool, you can jump from A to C and things like that. But yeah, so the whole kind of point of these games is, I think, really exploring, powering up, and then kind of using those power-ups to continue to explore in a usually non-linear progression. So additional recommended views. Summoning Salt on YouTube is a really great channel that's kind of got the history of some speedrun world records. So I didn't really talk about, I mean, I mentioned sequence breaking, but another thing that's always kind of fascinated me is speedrunning, where people take one game and just try and beat it as quickly as possible. Summoning Salt does a really great job of breaking down what those specific games are, what those records are, and kind of the work that players have done to find new skips, find new techniques, research new ways to break the game in the ways that developers never intended, just to shave milliseconds off of times. And some of these older ones, like some of the Nintendo Entertainment System, like the old NES games, the difference between, you know, world record runs and non-world record runs is literally a matter of multiple frames that the game is rendering. So it's kind of an interesting intersection of something that I feel is relatively akin to hacking and trying to break all of these things and do it as fast as possible. Also, Games Done Quick, GDQ, they do an event twice a year that raises money for Doctors Without Borders, and that's a speedrunning event where there's always a large variety of games that get played. Really great background content if you're working, and also just kind of stuff that's really fascinating to me. It always really amazes me that there are games like, I don't know, Bugs Bunnies, just like the weirdest, most esoteric games that did not get a lot of kind of play, I think, in mainstream culture, that someone has found and decided to unearth and decided to try and master and speed run, which I think is something kind of interesting. All right, so what are those analogies when we look at pen testing, right? So when we get dropped on a network or have a starting testing host, I think there is a very clear analogy to kind of starting off with one of these games. We kind of have the whole world at our feet. We're on an enterprise network with maybe 5,000 other machines, you know, 10,000 users. Where do we go first? Excuse me. As I said before, there's not always a clearly laid out linear progression of what you should do and where you should go and how you should do it. So there's a little bit of kind of like, the choice is yours, choose your own adventure. What do you want to try? You know, how well will that work? And kind of selecting and prioritizing those things, I think, is something that you get better at as you do more pen tests, because we are working on a limited time frame. You know, if I'm on a test that I only have 2 weeks on or 1 week on, then prioritizing those attack paths might look different than if it's kind of a longer purple team where I've got a full 4 weeks to really like dig into one specific service or something like that. So learning how to prioritize those things is something that I think you get better at as you have the experience and exposure to them. But when you first get dropped on one of these boxes, you know, the world does really seem like your oyster, and there's a lot of things that you could try, and trying to figure out where to go first is often kind of the hardest step, I think. Also, if anyone has ever done, you know, hack the box type challenges, or for me, when I did the OSCP, there was kind of this expectation that rabbit holes exist in environments. And we see this a lot more these days too with things like canary tokens, canaries in general, where these are like deceptive technologies intended to waste attackers' time. I don't think anyone in security is foolish enough to think that these tools will prevent breaches and intrusions, but I think minimizing the amount of time that an attacker can dwell on a network before detection and expulsion is kind of more of the name of the game than like strict, you know, keeping someone out of a network. So things that are intended to waste time, you know, as a pen tester, if you find a service that you think is vulnerable, how much time should you spend poking around at that before you realize that it's not going to get you anywhere and move on to the next thing? Because realistically, you're never going to find everything on a pen test. There's always more. Some of these environments that you test have been, you know, deployed Windows environments that have been around for 15 or 20 years, right? Or more. Like there is a tremendous amount of stuff on those networks in those environments. So we need to be realistic about what provides the most impact and value to the client, and what's worth kind of spending time focusing on and moving on from. One of the things John, our boss, likes to say is try 5 things for 5 minutes. And I think this is a really good kind of tool for if you find something and you spend more than 5 or 10 minutes on it and you feel like you're not getting where, maybe move on. You can always come back to it, but there are so many things that you can focus on that if the first thing that you find, you spend 2 days trying to get it to work and you end up missing coverage for other things in the environment, that's kind of a missed opportunity and a missed value add for the client who report you're delivering. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think one of the more important things to keep in mind is starting context for these types of tests. I think context in general is always helpful and maybe the most important part of what we do. Just a vulnerability in and of itself is obviously important and should be remediated, but understanding how that vulnerability was found, how that vulnerability could be exploited, how we got to that vulnerability in the first place, what steps would an attacker take or need to take to be able to find that, do something with it, and what's the impact. That context is highly valuable. And probably without that context, I would argue that the vulnerability is much less impactful to understand, at least for stakeholders in the organization. So here's a couple different just kind of general ideas of what starting context could look like. I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of assumed compromise testing. This is a test where you're kind of seeded access. So we're not working to gain a foothold from an external perspective. We're not sending payloads. We're not trying to get into the environment from an external context. The client is giving us a workstation that is Active Directory joins. The client is giving us Active Directory credentials, typically low privilege user, or if there's a specific group that they want to try and see as a starting context, like maybe someone from HR. Often the best place to do that is if there's a recently terminated employee. These will often have things like real world artifacts that an attacker might use, that if you have an account that's spun up specifically for the purposes of that test, those artifacts might not be there, but those artifacts could be something that an attacker could leverage for lateral movement or privilege escalation, or just have sensitive data in them on their own. And we're also usually given remote access to that workstation. So that's kind of the starting context for an assumed compromise test. For an internal network test, this is usually an implant deployed on a client network. These feel like are less narrative driven types of tests, whereas an assumed compromise is, hey, I started here, this is what I did, then I went here, then I went here, then I went here. I think an internal network penetration test is a little bit more broad in its scope and trying to do as much vulnerability discovery as possible. Also a little bit more like kind of lower level network layer based attacks and relays and things like that you might not often get to if you're doing an assumed compromise test. We like to say that that's kind of more the mile wide and 1 inch deep type of test, where we're trying to get as much comprehensive coverage of vulnerabilities that exist within the environment as possible, whereas assumed compromise is a little bit more Active Directory focused, a little bit more configuration focused, less about finding perhaps outdated versions of certain software systems, but more about those kind of complex Active Directory configurations and vulnerabilities that could arise from the way that those are deployed. And then for a web application test, usually there's a self sign up for like account generation, or we have an account provisioned by the client. So these are all kind of like the starting points for getting dropped into this world, getting dropped into this environment. Usually a low privilege user trying to elevate privileges, trying to escalate privileges, trying to move laterally, trying to get to juicy data. But we're usually starting off pretty unprivileged. And so this is kind of an overall starting context of what that looks like for these different types of tests. So once we start off, what's the first thing that we do? Right. So I mentioned it earlier, but I'll get back to it now, is the OODA loop. So I think this was pioneered by someone in the Air Force. I might need to pay Lockheed Martin a small fee for saying this out loud and using the image on the slide. That's a bad joke. But essentially, this is observe, orient, decide, act, and repeat. So the point of this is to be an iterative decision-making function that you continually do. You continually look around, see what's around yourself, see how you are oriented within that environment, decide what to do the thing, and then once again, observe, orient, decide, and act, and repeat. So the interesting thing about this to me, I think, is because it's iterative, as more information is made available to you, as more progress is made to you, then this decision-making process can change. So when you first start off on a host, the things that you have access to and the things you might be able to see on that machine might be very different if you come back to that initial host once you've gotten local admin access to that host, right? So the information gathering that you could initially do on that machine is very different from the information gathering that you could do once you escalate privileges locally on that machine. So performing this kind of iteratively over and over, whenever you get somewhere new, whenever you find new credentials, whenever you move to a new host, I think is kind of a useful tool for helping you make decisions about what to do next and understand kind of where you are. So the first thing that we do once we get on these boxes, if we're doing an assumed compromise test, I would say, is understanding kind of what weapons or tools we have available, right? So what do we have at our disposal as an attacker? What sorts of tools can we use? Do we even have access to a command prompt? Can we even run a command? Can we type out a command? Has PowerShell and CMD been blocked from the host with application deny listing tools? Do we need to run PowerShell without PowerShell, which is where you're dumping command line arguments into a shortcut to another executable and trying to get them to be processed that way? How can we get more tools in the box, right? Do we have access to the Microsoft Store? Can we download tools like Python or a localized Kali Linux instance from the Microsoft Store onto the testing host? How do we get more data in and out of the environment, right? Can we establish a C2 channel? Is SSH natively on the box? Has that been removed? Because that's a great way to get an outbound tunnel to funnel tools back into the environment. Is there application allow listing, deny listing? Can we drop unsigned random binaries under the host and get them to run? Just an aside too about EDR. This is kind of, you know, I'm not a red teamer. I do a pen test. And if I have a week to pen test, what we'll generally do is ask the client to leave EDR from, you know, on for the first day. I'll see what I can do to get around it. But I'm not going to spend a week trying to get around CrowdStrike. The assumption there is that threat actors eventually will find a way to get around CrowdStrike, right? It's not my responsibility to do that. And me spending a week trying to get around CrowdStrike is really only providing useful telemetry to CrowdStrike for them to improve their product and not necessarily finding gaps and controls within the client's environment or necessarily anything actionable that the client can improve to bolster their security within the environment too. So I know that's kind of a hot topic about obfuscation and EDR and evasion, and that's kind of my soapbox opinion about it, given a limited testing window of a week or two, just generally not worth it trying to get around EDR. What do network controls look like, right? I've seen a lot of tests where clients have really great port filtering for outbound TCP connections, where they've limited that down to 53, 80, 443. Everything leaving the network has to go out in one of those ports. Limiting that outbound traffic does allow for more deep and robust inspection of that traffic. If you've got every allowed TCP port that is allowed outbound, the opportunities for inspecting and detecting suspicious or malicious traffic on those ports is much harder, still possible, but much harder to do. What does web content filtering look like? Web traffic inspection look like, right? Can we access things like GitHub to load code from GitHub repos? Can we access pastebin to exfiltrate data in base64 encoded blobs? Can we get on facebook.com, which is, as we know, a very viable social engineering attack path? So a lot of the things that we're doing here, when we're kind of seeing what we can get away with and what tools we have, a lot of these things can be findings in and of themselves, right? Access to commonly abused administrative utilities, the ability to downgrade PowerShell to PowerShell version 2, the ability to install malicious tools from the Microsoft Store, you know, not enough filtering on outbound network traffic. All of these things help inform what abilities you have to do the things that we need to do, but they're also really great opportunities for the client to further kind of bolster what that baseline image for workstations within the environment is. When it comes to hardening, I think all of these are really great kind of potential add-on findings for less hardened hosts or opportunities for further hardening, if that makes sense. So in addition to kind of what tools we have and what we can do, we want to look at what attributes our account has, what permissions our account has, what rights that account has. So there's a lot of net commands you can run to look at sort of what groups your user is a member of. Do any of those groups look like they might have inherited elevated permissions? There's a lot of times when accounts are configured in Active Directory when that account is accidentally put into a group that it shouldn't be a part of that might have elevated permissions within the environment. What is the password policy, right? This is another thing that's just good to know if you're going to be doing password spraying. And even, you know, a possibility for a finding here. Like if you run this command net accounts /domain, and the password policy only requires 8 characters, maybe you're not able to actively take advantage of that weak password policy with password spraying, but you know if you do recover hashes, there could be a potential for some of those passwords to be cryptographically weak, and that is an opportunity for the client to further bolster the security of the environment by improving the minimum required length of that password policy. So something that is useful for you to know as an attacker and could be used, but also something that could be handed off as a finding for the client to improve. What other local accounts are configured on the machine, right? This is an interesting one because a lot of times clients will deploy or configure non-standard local administrator accounts, and also checking which Active Directory groups might have administrative rights to those machines. So all of this you can do, with this user manager, local user and group manager tool. This is a native tool that's, installed on Windows by default. You're not running anything malicious. You're literally just opening this tool up and kind of inspecting properties for some of those accounts on the machine and seeing what they can do. Can we log into Office 365? This is something that we see a lot these days, where you get on one of these machines, you log into Office 365, and the credentials for Office 365 are kind of inherited because you're on an Active Directory joined machine already. Can we try going to the Azure portal, right? Can we view all of the users and Entra, Azure AD, whatever Microsoft is calling it these days, and do even more kind of Active Directory enumeration from that page? Can we deploy Azure resources, right? These are all things that are worth checking and things that are easy to check without even really running weird tools on a box. You can just open a web browser and visit portal.azure.com and see if you can go to the users page, and that's a finding. Who's in the domain admins group, right? Is it an overpopulated group? Are there 25 accounts in domain admins? Is one of them Nessus_SVC that is likely not an actual user? Good things to know, and also findings that could be handed off to a client. So the next thing to try and understand is where we can get with what we've found. What are the lateral movement opportunities for our account? Is there sensitive data on the machine itself? I've done a number of tests where, as part of the deployment process for machines or VDIs, there's a number of batch scripts that might create local admin accounts that are meant to be deleted after that batch script is completed, but it's not deleted. So there could be sensitive data on the machine itself, just from that deployment process, that could be used. Is there anything sensitive on SharePoint or Azure? We kind of talked about Azure already, but if you go on SharePoint as an authenticated user and just search for the string password, are you going to find anything? Are you going to find password reset instructions that might have what a default kind of newly configured or provisioned user's password is before it gets changed? Can you spray that and find accounts where they haven't logged in and updated and changed that password for the first time, right? And then this is just a funny aside about one time I tried to RDP onto a domain controller as a standard user. This is the second I got in a box, and surprisingly it worked. So don't count anything out, because there are a lot of configuration issues that exist, and you would honestly be surprised with what you could get away with. So some of the tools we can use to do some of that enumeration and figuring out where we can get with what we've got. Bloodhound, I feel like, is kind of the go-to de facto Active Directory attack path enumeration and visualization tool. Very well signatured against, right? But we don't care about EDR. But if you do care about EDR, you can also run things like AD Explorer, which is a native Windows tool that'll let you export kind of a snapshot of an Active Directory environment. You can then kind of create Bloodhound data from that snapshot itself without having to run known bad tools on a host. One of the things that I like to use is Plumhound. This is a tool developed by a couple of my colleagues, Kent and Jordan. It takes Bloodhound data and creates kind of actionable reports that are lists of things, essentially a large number of Bloodhound queries that could be useful. We added some new ones to that are kind of some hunt queries, so looking for accounts that might have passwords older than 5 years, things like that could kind of be used for offensive targeting. Snaffler, which is kind of the go-to de facto tool for me for finding sensitive data on network file shares. There's a whole webcast I did on using Snaffler to look for sensitive data, so you can go find that on YouTube if you're interested. Things like PowerView, trying to find local admin access for your account. Things like CrackMap exec for SMB enumeration or RDP enumeration. I still use the CrackMap that's built into most machines these days by default, but I think that's kind of been superseded by NetExec, or whatever that new tool is called, but similar functionality. different name, maybe more features. So we're dropped on a machine. We've kind of taken a context of what we have available at our disposal, what our account can do, what tools we can use, where we might have other local, account or local administrative permissions or access in general. So what do we do with all that data, right? So the next thing that we need to do is try and update our map. One of the things that I think is super important that I didn't always do when I first started testing is saving output from all of these commands. I think having that data at your disposal is a lifesaver. Not having to go back and rerun an enumeration command will save you time, will save you energy. The artifacts of all these enumeration commands are also things that are great to hand off to a client in a supporting data archive, because what are the odds that someone at the client's team is running all these commands that you're doing and has all of this data readily disposable at hand? They're probably not, right? So all of this data I think is helpful. Maybe not necessarily useful to be included in the test itself and the report itself, but being able to hand that off to the client and say, yeah, you can go back and check what those granular permissions were for this account from this text file when we ran, et cetera, et cetera. And then reporting, right? So kind of the unspoken least favorite part about pen testing for a lot of people, but reporting for the client is the most important part of what we're doing. If we don't report on it, then it didn't happen. One of the things that we try and preach here at Black Hills is reporting as you go, reporting as you test. Spend 5 minutes running a command and then spend 15 minutes writing up what you did and why. And this will save your sanity, right? This is the best way and the only way I think that you should be reporting. I think we've all been in positions where we have been trying to crunch time, finish a report at the end of a testing window where we got off on a rabbit hole and spent 2 days just running commands without reporting what we were doing, and then having to go back through screenshots, collaborate timelines, and figure out what commands you ran and when and what worked and what didn't is kind of a pain and just not fun. So report as you go. It will make your life tremendously easier than doing it all at the end. And the other thing about this is building out a methodology. So as you're doing these commands, as you're running these commands, as you're going through these steps, save them in a note file, save the commands that you ran. That way, next time you are on a test, you don't have to go look up the syntax for that one command. You can just run it again. When I first started doing this type of work, I had a mentor who had a .text file with all of his commands, and it was huge. He'd been testing for a long time before that. I was like, hey man, that's nice. Can you send me that? Can I have that? And he was like, no, I'm not going to give you this file. You need to do it yourself. You need to run it yourself the first time. You need to troubleshoot it. You need to understand what the flags do, why you're running those commands. And once you have that understanding, then you get to save it into your own file and it becomes one of your tools. Having someone just hand that off to you and having you run arbitrary commands without necessarily knowing what they're doing or why, especially in enterprise environments, could be a recipe for disaster. So the other nice thing about kind of saving all of this stuff is it helps you build out your own methodology. So not necessarily an order or a list, or not an order of things to do, but a list of things to try, right? Something that you can kind of come back to and say, okay, well, I did this, that didn't work. I tried this, that didn't work. I tried this, what's left? And so kind of making sure that you've got good coverage over what you want to try and get done in an environment, I think is helpful. Cool. So some real world examples. This is one that happened to me a couple weeks ago in a test where we found out that the initial testing account had local admin on the machine, but only that machine. So we couldn't really move laterally with that, couldn't really get anywhere else. So what can we do with local admin on that one machine, right? So the first thing that we did was try and dump LSAS with Process Explorer. That worked. Process Explorer is another Windows native tool that should be signatured against for running, but is often not. So we dumped LSAS, exfiltrated that dump, ran a Python implementation of Mimikatz. Didn't see other NTLM hashes for other accounts besides ours. So oftentimes when you kind of run Mimikatz on recovered LSAS dumps, you're hoping to find either NTLM hashes or plaintext creds for other accounts that you can leverage for lateral movement or to impersonate those accounts. Didn't see anything besides ours, but because we had system, we could recover the DP API keys from the system as part of that dump. We checked if SCCM was configured. We're in this command here. and pulled an encrypted blob, saw that SCCM was configured, was able to recover that encrypted blob with network access account credentials, was able to use the recovered DP API keys from LSAS dump and exfiltrate plain text credentials for that network access account, which ended up being an overprivileged account that gave us RDP and administrative permissions to pretty much every workstation within the environment. From that point, we're kind of rinsing and repeating, initiating more RDP connections to those other hosts, dumping LSAS, et cetera, until we kind of get to where we would like to get to. There's a link here, which will be in the link slide as well at the end, about a SpecDrops post about NAA accounts and SCCM and how overprivileged those can be and how abusive those can be in an environment. So something interesting that I used for the first time is abusing those NAA creds, but kind of a fun example. Another example, so Kerber roasting. We didn't really talk about this yet, but domain accounts that have associated service principal names or SPNs are vulnerable to Kerber roasting attacks, where attackers are allowed to recover Kerberos hashes for those accounts. Those can then be used in offline password cracking attacks. The last time I did this successfully, as I mentioned, we recovered a Nessus service account password. A lot of times when clients are using Nessus internally, they're giving it elevated permissions so they can do authenticated Nessus scanning, which is obviously very different from just kind of open port fingerprint scanning. Because that service account was overly privileged, by recovering that password, we ended up gaining local administrator rights on a number of other machines in our initial testing host. Once we have those elevated permissions, dump LSAS from the machine, look for sensitive data, et cetera, so on and so forth. So the thing that I want to try and reiterate from these two examples is kind of repeating those steps, repeating the steps of seeing where our account can get, what we can do, what's available to us. Once we gain access to a new account, do that same thing one more time, right? So I mentioned earlier running Snaffler, which will look for interesting files on network file shares. That's another great one to rerun once you gain access to other accounts, because there could be network shares that your initial testing user doesn't have access to, but one of these other elevated accounts might not have admin places, but it might have access to some network shares that have more sensitive data, with pen keys or plain text credentials or things of that nature. So kind of revisiting this loop and continuing to observe, orient, decide, and act once we get somewhere new, once we get to something new. What can this finding get us? Where can this new account get us? And repeating this iteratively over and over throughout the course of the engagement, I think, is really helpful for making sure that you get good coverage and you're not missing anything, and you're kind of using the things that you find to the maximum possible impact. One of the other things that I kind of wanted to mention is kind of what's the end goal of a pen test, right? Like are you ever finished? Probably not. Is the goal just to get domain admin? Could be. I mean, that does demonstrate impact, but is there something more impactful to the client? I have another slide in a little bit that we'll talk about that a little bit more. So as I mentioned before, oftentimes you'll find things that you might not necessarily know what to do with at the time. It's good to kind of save all that stuff in like a loot file. Maybe you find web application credentials, but you can't necessarily find where that web application lives and what to do with those. Save those in a file, maybe spray them later. Maybe you'll find the web app later. Kind of having all of that loot data in one specific central place to be able to use and reference as you continue testing, I think is really helpful. Instead of saying, oh yeah, I remember seeing plain text credentials in this .config file 2 days ago, but now I can't remember where that file is or what those credentials were. Kind of streamlining that process by keeping things in one place will help you use them if you could find potential opportunities to use those later during the test. Awesome. And I mentioned engagement objectives earlier. So I think one of the things that people often forget is that domain admin isn't always the goal when you're doing a pen test. The goal for us as testers is to provide as much value as possible to the client. That value can look like a lot of different things, right? I think that's kind of up for the client to decide. And one of the things that we like to try and do, I like to try and do, is talk to that client before the test even starts. Figure it out what they're interested in learning from this test, right? A lot of times the client will just say, oh, it's compliance. We do this once a year. This is our annual test. Just do it. But sometimes, they'll say, we've made these changes to on-prem versus cloud exchange. We want to see how that's looking and working. We've just deployed, SSO for these endpoints. We want to make sure that that is deployed correctly. Understanding the business context of what you're testing and why kind of helps provide that value to the client, I think, in a way that isn't just necessarily, we got domain admin, game over, now I'm going to go write the report and not do anything for the last 2 days. I think this is something that threat actors are also aware of. I don't think threat actors are necessarily trying to elevate permissions to domain admin all the time. Usually these highly privileged accounts and groups have additional controls and visibility on them. And sometimes there are ways to get to sensitive data without obtaining domain admin permissions. Sometimes there are ways to deploy ransomware within environments without doing something as noisy or detectable as elevating permissions to domain admin. So just something to keep in mind that, it is great to get DA, and there's a lot that you can do after that. Trying to understand what demonstrates value or what provides value and what demonstrates impact to the client, I think is a little bit more helpful when it comes to creating an actionable report that everyone is happy with and can be used. At the bottom here, I've got some kind of random things that I have been asked to do on pen tests to demonstrate impact. Things like accessing repositories for proprietary source code. Someone asked me one time to get a screenshot of the CEO's Outlook inbox, which was a funny one. Finding database backups, things like that. So just some kind of other end goals to keep in mind besides just elevating to DA. So another interesting thing I kind of mentioned earlier, the idea of sequence breaking, the ability to kind of break the standard scripted progression of what you should be doing. This is really important and maybe key to speedrunning, finding ways that you can just straight up abuse glitches in the game to get things done that you shouldn't be able to do. A fun example of this is this wall jumping GIF down here from Super Metroid, where never really explained anywhere. The only way that you could learn this is by watching these little creatures do it and kind of inferring from contextual clues that maybe I, as the player, could do that too. The thing about this wall jump stuff specifically for this game is it's not necessary for progression. You can beat the game without ever wall jumping, but because it's been included in there, developers knew that it could be used. You could skip entire portions of the game with this. And that's kind of an interesting little inclusion of breaking the sequence of things. So there are ways you can do that in pen tests too. The number one way that we see for completely breaking the sequence of a pen test is Active Directory certificate services abuse. This is one that, isn't necessarily always a kind of long drawn out narrative of I got here and then I got here and then I got here and then I got here. If ADCS is configured poorly, this can be like a 1 or 2 command attack path to elevating permissions to domain admin. So you're bypassing looking for creds and file shares, bypassing running Bloodhound in general, bypassing local privesc, straight to DA, do not pass go, game over, go fix it. But kind of in that vein, if you run these tools on day 1 of a 5-day pen test and get domain admin, what are you doing for the remainder of those 5 days, right? So that kind of gets back to understanding what provides value to a client, understanding different engagement objectives, and also getting back to your methodology of saying, okay, we tried this and it worked. Let's go look at all the other things that we would normally try had this not worked, right? So just kind of an aside. Takeaways, treat every test like a game. Figure out the mechanics, figure out the limitations of your environment, figure out your starting context, figure out where you are, what you can do, what you can get away with, and how to get away with those things. When can those lead to lateral movement? When can those lead to privilege escalation? Use the OODA, the OODA loop again and again and again. Every time you get on a new machine, every time you find credentials, every time you impersonated a user, continually be looking around, orienting yourself, understanding the context of where you are now and seeing where you can get from there. And last but not least, document your journey. Not only is the report your deliverable, but documenting everything that you're doing will help provide you with a more robust methodology that can serve as your own kind of wiki for a pen testing approach and methodology when you're on these tests in the future. And once you do enough of these, you start to see how these vulnerabilities repeat themselves, these configuration issues repeat themselves. So having that kind of methodology that you've developed from doing the thing over and over will really serve you in your career. And last but not least, have fun. Pen tests are fun. There are a lot of people that would love to pen test because it is cool and it is a good time and it is enjoyable. And there are a lot of people who are pen testers who get burnt out and don't have good work-life balance and struggle with the monotony of the work sometimes, but it is a fun thing to do. And so trying to find joy in the work will ultimately serve you and help you do better work and also not hate your life as much. Cool. And I've got a slide page here at the end and 14 minutes left and an opportunity for questions.
Well done, Ben.
Thanks, Deb.
I'm not surprised. It has been. Well done. Yeah. Good job. How you feel?
I feel sweaty.
You feel sweaty? Yeah, okay.
But that's okay.
Well, if you're sweaty in Chicago, then you're doing all right.
Yeah, things could be worse.
Yeah, it could be worse.
I've had that feeling too.
Yeah, you're in Florida.
Well, you're so excited about the webcast and you've got so many good ideas. And then you're like, did I get them all out there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great job, Ben.
Great job. Yeah, we have time for questions. We have 14 minutes.
All the questions just say hack it.
All the questions. Yes. If you don't know, we are doing Hack It, which is kind of like Book It. If you had Book It as a kid, if you watch 10 webcasts, we have a prize for you. If you watch 20, we have another prize for you. So if you missed it at the top of the hour, go ahead and just say hi. You could say Hack It. You could say Ben was amazing. You could, whatever you want to type in there, engage and say hello.
So there was a little conversation, Ben, about findings and documentation, and the Discord channel there was some conversation about Obsidian. Notion wasn't mentioned. Do you have any feelings or recommendations on the tools you use to document things?
That's a good question. I feel like the new meta hotness is everyone is using Obsidian. I like the extensibility of Obsidian and all of the crazy stuff that you can do with it. I personally have just a flat markdown text file that I use to easy copy paste in and out of. But that file does import into Obsidian. I know Graham, I don't know if Graham is watching this, but Graham Helton put out a really good talk or blog post maybe about note taking and documenting that I'm sure you can find with a quick Google, or we can drop a link in chat. But
yeah, he was here.
Yeah, people seem to love Notion. People seem to love Obsidian. I just use a flat text file because I'm a noob.
Your choice. Ben, what is your favorite Metroidvania game?
The last one I played that I really enjoyed was probably Blasphemous, although I did go on like a kind of revisiting all of the Metroid ones. I jailbroke a Nintendo DS, which was surprisingly easy to do. And I played through a couple on there. And then Metroid Dread was like their 2D kind of Metroid old school throwback one that Nintendo put out a couple years ago, which was really fun. The one that got me into the genre, believe it or not, was Metroid Prime in like 2004. And since then, I've kind of gone back and revisited the older classics.
Have you ever been asked or requested by a red team to help them on a campaign?
What does that mean? Work?
Yeah.
I don't understand the question.
So you're not a red teamer.
I've helped out on those types of engagements.
I think the question is other engagements, have they enlisted, your technique?
Yeah, I think we work relatively collaboratively at Black Hills too. So if someone gets stuck, they'll drop a question and people hop on a call to try and troubleshoot or help or give advice, things like that.
Okay, referring back to your mentor who told you to figure out each command on your own, how did you take this challenge and what lessons did you learn along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I was a little bit offended that he wouldn't just give me his cheat sheet, but I get it. I get it now that I've spent years building out my own. But he also referred to it as like kind of like a live range, like don't send packets down range without knowing what they do. So I think contextualizing it like that, which may be a little bit violent of a metaphor to compare it to bullets in a firing range, but I think that kind of helped me understand the potential impact of doing those things incorrectly and the ramifications that they could have. Yeah, so I think doing that stuff at home and labs and learning environments and places where you can kind of figure out what works and what doesn't and what's going to break things, and hopefully not breaking things in a client environment, which is something I'm trying to avoid.
Very good. How long did that take you to build your own?
I mean, I put something new on that once a week probably. So
yeah.
Is that going to go in your will? Like I leave my cheat sheet to my children?
I mean, I think at this point, it's like the first third of it probably doesn't work anymore either, as things continue to grow and change in the world. But yeah.
People would like you to speak about your keyboards. You see all your keyboards in the back.
Oh, yeah. There's a bunch. There's what do I got? One of them I soldered and put together by myself, like that Stormtrooper one in the middle. I forget what brand that one was. The top one is a Poker 3. The bottom one was like a Novel Keys one. The one I use is this one, the Rama, which is the big heavy.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, and I lost the key. But yeah, just a dumb expensive hobby and something that you use all the time. So I figured why not.
Ben, can you speak a little bit about work-life balance with your job? It's always
yeah,
concern for anyone that loves what they do.
Yeah, I think that there is trying to break into the field means you do a lot of things in your off time to get better. You do a lot of hack the box, you study for certificates, you enjoy the work. And then once you start doing the work, I think that it's hard to draw the line between, okay, it's 5 p.m. I'm not going to do more hacking, because if you continue to do more hacking, you can, right? Like I know a lot of people that do that, but I don't think you're doing yourself any favors. I think once you get to a place where you can continue to grow and develop during a work day, then I think there should be less pressure to do that stuff outside of work in your evenings. But yeah, I mean, I've worked at a firm where we were doing, 50, 55, 60-hour work weeks at times. And the time that it takes to burn out from that type of work is much shorter than the time it takes to recover from that burnout. So I think establishing boundaries, I think being fortunate enough to work for, an organization that actively looks out for the testers' time and values their employees' work-life balance is also important, but also just establishing those boundaries yourself, right? Like I know people that at 4:59, they're shutting down their computer and they don't have Slack or Teams or anything on their phone. And if something happens that's an emergency, they might get a phone call, but if not, they're going to get to it when they get back the next morning at 9:01 a.m.
Agreed. Yeah, I'm not a hacker and I still struggle with that. I've come to believe that it's people that really love what they do, they're the people that burn out the quickest, because it's hard to turn it off.
Yeah, especially if you work at home and like you're just in this one space all the time. I think that was for me one of the things about going to an office is like, okay, if I'm going to the office, I can leave it at the office, and once I go home, it's at the office. But having kind of those spaces intermingle, working remote and since COVID and things like that, I think you just have to be a little more intentional about those boundaries and how you establish them.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Any other questions that Kelly, Brian, you see any? Or feel free to ask any. I'll be watching if you've missed your chance. And thank you guys so much for your questions and for joining us today. Ben, you did a fantastic job. Always cool as a cucumber when you
Thanks
give
for listening to me.
Super chill.
I do have one thing to add, and I'm not a hacker either. Most people know this, but I want to advocate for a really amazing book called How to Build a Second Brain, if you're not familiar with it. It's a book that basically talks about setting up a methodology of how you want to store digital information. They call it the PARA method. And of course, the words just flew out of my brain. But the questions around Obsidian and Markdown text and how to store information, I don't think it's necessarily a question about what tool to use. It's a question of how do you want to design your system so you can keep track of things. So I highly recommend that book. It's called Building the Second Brain.
Yes, CJ's definitely recommended that a lot. Yeah, good tip about not having work stuff on your phone. That's been very helpful for me to not have any kind of work related stuff on my phone.
Like a year ago, I tuned down all of the notifications on my stuff too.
Same.
I think that was also a game changer.
Yeah.
Instead of letting a device run my life and dictate me, I get to choose when I look at it.
It is a tool, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up. Ben, if you could summarize the whole last hour into one final thought. Final thoughts with Ben.
I think if you grew up playing games or you actively play a lot of video games, then I think a lot of the mentality and methodology and approach to pen testing is something that you already know. You just need to shift to using these tools in this environment versus playing the game. But I think the approach is pretty comparable and will probably get you much further than you'd expect, honestly.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. We do have another webcast coming right up. We're going to be talking about the DEN Secure Backdoors and Breaches expansion deck that we did with them. So if you guys go back to the lobby, click the other link, and then we'll meet you on the other webcast. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you over there.
Bye.
That was awesome. Bye, guys.
Ryan, you going to kill it? Kill the fire?